Now, we've had some new revelations about the sports grants scandal this week from the Senate inquiry looking into it. It's been revealed that by the time the approvals were signed off, a lot of the projects, some 43% of them, were ineligible.
Now, the head of the Prime Minister's own department has also conceded that there were, and quote here, significant shortcomings in the government's handling of the controversial sports grant scheme. Well, let's discuss this further with our Poly panel. We're joined this morning by Labor MP Anika Wells, the member for Lily in Queensland, and we're also joined by Liberal MP Tim Wilson, who is the member for Goldstein in Victoria. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. Now, it does seem that this is a story that just does not seem to go away at all. It has become the albatross around the Prime Minister's neck here. I tend to think that there seems to be this fine line between pork barrelling and actual funding for the community. Tim, where do you draw that line?
Well, the line we're focused on is making sure that sports infrastructure where there's community need is being delivered to Australians, and that's the focus of this program as well as many other programs, because, you know, when you've got sports facilities where they don't have women's changing rooms because of historical issues of gender inequity, that needs to be addressed, where upgrades
But
need to be achieved.
that's also been used as an excuse in some of these programs as well.
What, to make sure that we're delivering this facilities to the people who need them? That's true, because that's the core focus, is actually making sure that we support communities on the ground. And, you know, Labor did the same at the election. They made a series of promises for sports infrastructure across the country, and they're making different promises to different communities, and that's what the government's both did before the election and is getting on with now, is making sure that programs and rollouts are being done so that we can help build the future of the country.
Anika, we'll get to you in just a moment, but I wanted to pick up, Tim, on the issue of community need. So through this Senate inquiry this week, we've heard that by the time the approvals were signed off for 43% of these projects, they were ineligible. And the Prime Minister has said that they were eligible at the time of awarding them. But the fact that they weren't eligible by the time they were signed off, does that make the case for community need there, Tim?
No, this is a silly technicality. What it means is when they were awarded, they hadn't started, and many of them had then started to get on with it. That was one of the technicalities that was applied to whether they were eligible or not. You couldn't fund things that were previously being built. They were awarded, they started building, then by the time all the paperwork was signed off, they had commenced. So it's good because it shows very clearly that when the government makes commitments to spend money to build important community infrastructure, the communities were ready to build it, and we're getting on with the job to get the money and the resources to communities for local and important sports infrastructure as quickly as possible.
Anika, we can see that you're just impatient to weigh into this conversation as well. What's your take on it?
Local clubs getting done over by this government is not a silly technicality. It is so hard to hear this on behalf of all of the mums and the dads and the active citizens who volunteer for these sports clubs, who act in best faith, who did their best by the guidelines, only to hear last night that 270 ineligible projects were given money. 270 ineligible projects got money. What we needed to hear from Tim this morning was, I'm sorry. We're sorry. Australians are looking for some sense of contrition from this government and some sense of confidence that it's not going to happen again. And instead they get, this is a silly technicality. It is so frustrating to hear.
Anika, the head of the Prime Minister's office's own department this week conceded that there were significant shortcomings in the government's handling of this, that there was a lack of transparency. This was Phil Gaetjens, and that report has not been released. We had a page from him yesterday, but the actual full report has not been released. Is that something you'd like to see?
Well, a report coming from someone who can be hired and fired at will by the Prime Minister, someone who was previously a political operative of the Prime Minister, probably doesn't carry a lot of water to start with. And the fact that the Prime Minister can't even release that speaks to the omni-shambles that he is in. I mean, we had more evidence last night. The Prime Minister's office sent dozens of emails to the Minister's office. They are up to their necks in it. If they can't show us even this report, I think he's got a lot of questions to answer, and I think all Australians are very keen to hear them.
Tim, why do you think this issue has really come about under this particular government? You know, there didn't seem to be much of this sort of a reporting on this particular issue, on the sports rorts issue, in previous governments, but this particular government, under Scott Morrison, it's become headline grabbing.
Well, I think the clarity that's occurring is that there have been major projects that have been rolled out by this government, major grants programs to actually build community-based infrastructure to build the strength of the country from the citizen and community up. And so when you go down that path, there'll always be debates about how money's allocated, where it's allocated, on what time frame. It's because we're taking a community-first approach rather than a Canberra-based approach.
Marginal seat-first approach.
Well, no, community-based approach. I mean, as the reports have outlined, there was no additional money allocated to any particular type of seats, including Labor seats, any more or less as a consequence of this program. So when you take a community-first approach rather than a Canberra-based approach, people will debate how the money should be allocated.
We sure will.
We want to move on to our second topic this morning. And this week there's been reports of a so-called Otis Group forming, which is 20 right-aligned Labor MPs who've been meeting for dinner, and they've been discussing policy direction, particularly on climate change and on coal and the role of coal in the future. Does this, Anika, show that there is that policy division and policy disagreement within the Labor Party, particularly on climate and coal?
I think what it shows is that there are active MPs who want to represent their communities and do best by their country, trying to work out the biggest, most complex, polarising issue that our country has faced for 15 years. I mean, I know that I want us to transition to a renewables future as soon as possible. I want us to get to zero net emissions as soon as possible. I want us to put no new coal-fired power stations into the country and to support our coal workers and their families and their local towns that they love through transition and to help them with adaptation.
Does everyone in your party agree with you, though?
Well, everyone's representing their own communities, and that's a good thing. I think one of the problems is that we've been so polarised, we haven't been able to galvanise together and plot a sensible path through the middle. The fact that people want to talk these things out, that's how good policy is made. And I'm not going to cop any curry on this from Tim Wilson, who sits in a party room with dinosaurs who are holding the country back and who are misrepresenting the views of Australians and who are making this problem even worse. He's had 7 years of government to deal with this. He hasn't dealt with it. And I'm not going to cop any curry from this Prime Minister on any kind of debate happening about what to do.
Tim, it does seem that the Liberal Party doesn't seem to be talking about transition or transitional jobs at all. In fact, they want to be, they do seem to be quite pro-coal, particularly after the Nats kerfuffle with their leadership. And now it does seem to be that more of them are leaning towards the pro-coal lobby.
Well, that's just false. I mean, recently the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor, worked in partnership to develop a new project, gas project for transition and renewables in New South Wales. $200 million was spent on that exactly to build transition-based energy and transition-based jobs. And other states are developing their own proposals to do so. But what we're not going to do is commit to things where we have a marginal effect on emissions but cut jobs. Our focus is to cut emissions, not jobs.
But there are clear divisions in your party, particularly over the last couple of weeks. We've even heard people questioning the science of climate change and whether it's man-made. That was Jim Molan on the Q&A program. What side do you fall on there?
Well, I've consistently said, and I'm the only member of the House of Representatives who's actually studied climate science at a tertiary level, so my position's pretty naked. But the challenge for Australia is not just environmental, it's critically economic in making sure that we transition Australia's economy, address cutting emissions but not cutting jobs, to take the whole of the community forward with us. And yes, transition fuels play a critical part of that, and I just outlined before the major investment the federal government has made, working with the New South Wales government and working with the other states. Other programs will come forward as well. That comes off the back of the $3.5 billion clean energy programs that we introduced in the last term of Parliament. We're going to keep implementing them every step of the way to make sure Australia transitions to a cleaner future, but a prosperous future as well.
It was interesting, earlier this week, Barnaby Joyce was quoted as saying that coal or energy either makes or break an election. And it does seem that both major parties, the Liberal Party as well as the Labor Party, are at a crossroads at this stage. Do they comply with the demands of the coal industry, or do they comply with a nation, a population that's demanding change in terms of climate change policy? Which is more important to you, Tim?
No, what's important is to make sure that we're confronting the challenges that Australia faces. We can't solve global greenhouse gas emissions in isolation. We have to make sure that we create programs and a technology-focused approach so that we can reduce emissions without cutting jobs. And that's the critical point of division between us and the Australian Labor Party. They've always had a tax approach. We have a technology approach. And so using technology, we can reduce emissions and extend the life of existing energy generation. We can invest in new types of energy generation, including renewables, to help transition to that future. But it's not going to happen overnight. Transition is a journey. It isn't just flicking a switch.
But Anika, this is something that Labor is also having to deal with, particularly after the result of the last election. And I know earlier you were talking about the different members in your party having to represent their electorate and their electorate's interests. But this is something as a party that you'll have to decide an actual unified policy on.
It is, and one of the lessons that we took away from the election, and I'm from the magnificent Republic of Queensland, is that we need to bring everybody with us when we go. We need to make sure that we have good, sound policy that prepares us for the future, and we need to make sure that we take everybody with us. And I mean, I think something I took away from my experiences campaigning was that people were kind of afraid of what we were going to do. Now, they shouldn't be. We're there to look after them. We have their very best interests at heart. We are working night and day to best prepare our country for a renewables future and a transition that is already upon us. We've got a lot of work to do, but we have to take everybody with us when we go. We have to galvanise, not polarise.
All right, Anika Wells and Tim Wilson, we really appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.